August 18th, 1943, and Staff Sergeant Lawrence Stevens can't feel his hands anymore. 20 years old, crammed into the tail position of a B-17 flying fortress somewhere over Belgium, and the thermometer reads 42 degrees below zero. He's wearing silk gloves, then electric gloves, then fur-lined leather gloves on top of that, 3 layers, and he still can't feel his fingertips. The mission briefing that morning had been straightforward. Bomb the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, Germany. Return to base. Routine, except for one small detail that made every man in the briefing room go silent. The target was 300 miles inside Germany, beyond the range of fighter escorts. The B-17 seconds would be alone for over 2 hours in the most heavily defended airspace in the world. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Stevens had been a gunner for exactly 4 months. He'd learned aerial gunnery at Lowry Field in Denver, learned to field strip and reassemble a 50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun while blindfolded and wearing gloves, timed against a stopwatch. 2 minutes, every time, because in combat you might need to do it in the dead of night at 25,000 feet with German fighters coming at you from every direction. But here's what they didn't teach him at gunnery school, what they couldn't teach him, because the instructors on the ground in Colorado had never experienced it themselves. When a 50 caliber Browning jams at 42 degrees below zero, you have maybe 60 seconds to clear it before a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf comes around for another pass. 60 seconds to save your life, save your crew, save the entire formation that's depending on overlapping fields of fire to survive. And to clear that jam, you have to take off your gloves. All 3 layers. Because the mechanism is too delicate, too precise, too unforgiving to operate through fur-lined leather. You need bare fingers to feel the bolt, to manipulate the feed pawls, to strip the jammed round from the chamber. But at 42 below, exposed skin flash freezes in under a minute. Touch the metal with your bare hand, and the cold conducts straight through to the bone. You'll lose feeling instantly. Keep working, and you'll lose the fingertips entirely. Frostbite doesn't negotiate. It just takes. So, you have a choice. Let the gun stay jammed and hope the other gunners in your formation can cover your sector until German fighters punch through and kill everyone aboard, or fix the gun and lose your fingers. Most gunners chose their fingers, every single time, because a B-17 with 1 gun down was a wounded animal, and the Luftwaffe could smell weakness from 10 miles away. The Schweinfurt raid was supposed to be different. The first deep penetration strategic bombing mission, hitting the factories that produced the ball bearings that kept every German tank, aircraft, and machine gun operating. Cut off the ball bearing supply and you cripple the entire Nazi war machine. At least, that's what the planners in England told themselves. 376 B-17 seconds, 16 bomb groups, and over 3,000 men flying into the heart of Germany with no fighter escort. The confidence came from a simple belief that had been repeated so many times it had become gospel. The B-17 flying fortress could defend itself. 13 50 caliber machine guns on the late model B-17G, 2 in the chin turret, 2 in the top turret, 2 in the ball turret, 2 in the waist positions, 2 in the tail, 1 in the radio operator's position, 2 more in the cheek positions for the navigator. 13 guns, each capable of firing 600 rounds per minute, each round powerful enough to punch through engine blocks at 1,000 yards. In theory, a formation of B-17 seconds created a defensive box of overlapping fire so dense that no fighter could penetrate it. In theory, the Luftwaffe would break off attacks rather than fly through that wall of lead. In theory, the bombers would make it, to the target, drop their payload, and return to England with acceptable losses. The theory lasted approximately 1 hour and 30 minutes into German airspace. Then reality arrived in the form of 200 Luftwaffe fighters, and reality had guns of its own. The German pilots had learned. They'd studied American bomber tactics for 2 years, absorbed horrific losses in the process, and developed countermeasures. Instead of attacking from the sides or rear where the B-17 seconds had the most firepower, they came in from directly ahead. Nose-on attacks at closing speeds of 600 miles per hour, firing 20mm cannons and 30mm rockets that could tear a bomber apart from 1,000 yards out. The B-17F models in August 1943 had one 30 caliber machine gun in the nose. 30 caliber. The same round fired by infantry rifles, against fighters with armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks. It was like throwing stones at a tank. Messerschmitt after Messerschmitt dove through the formation. The bombers couldn't maneuver. They were locked into tight formations to maintain bombing accuracy, flying straight and level while German fighters picked them apart. The gunners fired back desperately, brass casings piling up ankle-deep on the aircraft floors, the smell of cordite so thick it burned the throat even through oxygen masks. And then the guns started jamming. Not occasionally, constantly. The 50 caliber Browning was a recoil-operated weapon. It relied on the force of each shot to cycle the bolt, eject the spent casing, and chamber the next round. At ground level in summer, the mechanism worked flawlessly. At 25,000 feet in winter, the gun oil thickened to the consistency of tar. Moisture from breath and condensation froze inside the receiver. Ammunition belts stiffened and refused to feed smoothly. Feed jams, bolt jams, extractor failures. Stovepipes, where the spent casing failed to eject and got wedged in the action. Double feeds where 2 rounds tried to chamber simultaneously. Each failure meant a gun down. Each gun down meant a gap in the defensive fire. Each gap meant another vector for German fighters to exploit. Stevens watched it happen in real time. The waist gunner's left gun went down first, jammed on a double feed. Then the top turret's right gun seized up completely, the bolt frozen in the closed position. The ball turret was still firing, but slower now, the gunner conserving ammunition because reloading in that cramped spherical cage was nearly impossible in combat. Stevens' own guns were still running. Twin 50 calibers, 565 rounds each. He'd test-fired them on the ground that morning, and they'd been perfect. But that was 7 hours ago in England, where the temperature was a balmy 50 degrees. Up here, the cold was eating everything metal. He could see frost forming on the ammunition belts, could feel the guns sluggish, resistant, fighting him with every burst. A Focke-Wulf 190 peeled off from the formation ahead and came straight at Stevens' aircraft from 6 o'clock low. Textbook tail attack. Stevens squeezed the triggers. Both guns fired. 10 rounds, 12, 15. Then the right gun stopped. Complete silence, except for the howl of wind and engines. Feed jam. He could tell from the feel. The ammunition belt had kinked or frozen, and a round was caught halfway into the chamber. Clear it now, or the Focke-Wulf would come around again, and next time there'd be only one gun to stop it. Stevens' heart was pounding so hard he could hear it over the engine noise. His hands were already numb inside 3 layers of gloves, but he could still move the fingers, could still grip and manipulate. That would change the moment he exposed them to the air. He grabbed the cocking handle with his left hand, still gloved, and tried to force the bolt back. Frozen solid. The mechanism wouldn't budge. He tried again, harder, putting his shoulder into it. Nothing. The bolt was locked in place by ice, or a jammed round, or both. No choice now. He had to get in there with bare hands. Had to feel what was wrong, because at 42 below zero, you couldn't see ice, couldn't see exactly where the jam was. You had to touch, had to manipulate blind. Stevens ripped off his right glove, all 3 layers at once, and the cold hit his hand like a hammer. Instant pain, sharp and electric, shooting up his forearm. He ignored it, reaching for the bolt with fingers that were already going numb. Found the latch, pulled back the charging handle with his left hand while using his right to guide the bolt. It moved. 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch. He could feel the resistance, feel something wrong in the feed mechanism. His right hand was screaming at him now, nerve endings firing panic signals. 30 seconds exposed. His fingertips were starting to lose feeling. He kept working, found the jammed round. It was bent, the casing crimped where it had fed wrong. He tried to clear it with his fingernails but couldn't get purchase. The metal was too cold, too slick. 45 seconds. His index finger was completely numb now. He couldn't feel the trigger anymore, couldn't feel anything past the second knuckle. He dug harder, got 2 fingers under the jammed casing, and yanked. It came free. He dropped it, grabbed a fresh round from the belt, chambered it manually, locked the bolt forward, and slammed his hand back into the gloves. Too late. The damage was done. His fingers were white, bloodless, frozen. They'd warm up, eventually, he told himself. They'd be fine. They had to be fine because there were still 2 hours to target and 2 hours back, and in 4 hours, he'd probably have to do this again. Maybe twice. Maybe 5 times. That was August 18th. One day after the Schweinfurt Regensburg raid that became legend. Stevens' mission was just another deep penetration run, another 800 men sent into Germany without adequate protection. Just another day in the air war. But Stevens survived. And when he got back to base that night, after the debriefing, after the medical inspection where a flight surgeon looked at his fingers and shook his head, Stevens found himself in the armory, found himself talking to a staff sergeant named Charlie Kepner, who'd been an aircraft armourer since 1941, old by Air Force standards, maybe 30 years old, balding, with grease under his fingernails and oil stains on his coveralls. Stevens showed Kepner his fingers. 3 of them were blistered white, the tissue dead beneath the skin. Frostbite, 2nd degree. He'd keep the fingers, the doc had said, but they'd never be quite right. Always be sensitive to cold. Always be a reminder of what it costs to clear a gun jam at altitude. How many of you are having this problem? Kepner asked. Everyone, Stevens said. Every tail gunner, every waist gunner, anyone who's not in a powered turret, we're clearing jams with bare hands and losing fingertips doing it. Kepner nodded slowly. He'd heard the stories. Hell, he'd seen the evidence every time a bomber came back from a mission. Blood on the gun mechanisms, bits of frozen skin stuck to metal, gunners with bandaged hands who couldn't hold a coffee cup but would be flying again in 3 days because the 8th Air Force didn't have enough trained replacements. The problem, Kepner said, isn't that the guns are jamming. Guns jam. That's physics and cold weather and bad luck. The problem is that clearing those jams is killing you as surely as German fighters. He walked over to his workbench, picked up something that looked like a modified screwdriver. The handle was wood, thick enough to grip through gloves. The shaft was steel, bent at a specific angle, with a hooked end that looked custom-made. Been working on something, Kepner said. Tool that lets you clear feed jams without taking off your gloves. Hook goes under the cartridge rim. Lever pressure pops it free. You can work the bolt with this end. He demonstrated, manipulating an imaginary action with smooth, practiced movements. Whole thing takes maybe 15 seconds instead of 60. And you keep your gloves on. Stevens looked at the tool, then at Kepner, then back at the tool. Does it work? In the shop? Yeah. Every time. On the aircraft? Don't know yet. Haven't tested it in combat conditions. Why not? Kepner set the tool down carefully. Because it's unauthorized. Not in any technical manual, not approved by the Ordnance Board. Just something I made in my spare time because I'm tired of watching you kids come back with ruined hands. Stevens understood immediately. The Army Air Force had procedures, regulations. Every piece of equipment on a combat aircraft had to be tested, certified, and officially issued. You couldn't just invent tools and start using them, even if those tools might save lives. That way led to chaos, led to gunners trusting equipment that might fail at the worst possible moment. Except the official equipment wasn't working. Gunners were trained to clear jams by hand. That was the procedure. Take off your gloves, clear the mechanism, put your gloves back on. The technical manual said nothing about 42 degrees below zero, said nothing about frostbite, said nothing about losing your fingers to save your gun. So what do I do? Stevens asked. Kepner picked up the tool again, looked at it, looked at Stevens, made a decision that would ripple through the 8th Air Force for the next 2 years. You take it. You test it. Next mission, You carry this tool in your flight suit pocket. Gun jams. You use it. See if it works at altitude. See if it's faster than the manual method. See if you can keep your fingers. And if someone notices? They'll notice, Kepner said flatly. You'll be using a tool that doesn't exist in any inventory. Flying with unauthorized equipment. If it fails and causes a problem, I'll probably face disciplinary action. Maybe court-martial for modifying combat aircraft without authorization. He handed the tool to Stevens. But if it works, and you come back with your hands intact, you tell me, and I'll make more, and I'll give them to every gunner in this group who wants one. And eventually, maybe someone in command will realize that sometimes the mechanics on the ground know things that the engineers in Ohio don't. Stevens took the tool. It was heavier than he expected, solid steel and hardwood. He could feel the craftsmanship in it, the careful angles, the precise bend in the hook that would let it slide under a cartridge rim without damaging the extractor. This wasn't something knocked together in an afternoon. This was engineering, problem-solving. A mechanic who'd looked at the reports of gunners with frost-bitten hands and decided that following regulations was less important than bringing people home alive. Next mission, Stevens promised. I'll test it. Next mission came 2 days later. Another deep penetration raid, this time to Düsseldorf. Same route, same altitude, same temperature, same problems. Stevens' left gun jammed at 10,000 feet over the North Sea. Classic double feed, 2 rounds trying to chamber simultaneously. He reached for the gun to clear it manually, fingers already preparing for the pain. Then he remembered the tool. He pulled it from his pocket, still wearing all 3 layers of gloves. Hooked the first round, levered it free. Same with the second round. Used the tool's lever end to cycle the bolt. Total time, maybe 20 seconds. His hands stayed warm the entire time. The gun was running again before the next wave of German fighters arrived. And when they came, Stevens had both guns operational, both firing, both filling his sector of the defensive box with exactly the firepower doctrine said should be there. He came back from that mission with all 10 fingers intact. No frostbite, no blisters, no dead tissue. Just a tool in his pocket that officially didn't exist and unofficially had just saved his hands from permanent damage. Stevens found Kepner in the armory that night, showed him his hands, told him the tool worked perfectly, worked better than the authorized procedure that was causing casualties before a single German fighter ever engaged. I need more of these, Stevens said. Every tail gunner in the squadron needs one, every waist gunner, every position where you can't wear heavy gloves while operating the guns. Kepner nodded. He'd known this was coming. I'll make them. But quietly. I'm not advertising this. I'm not writing reports about it. I'm just making tools and giving them to gunners, and if anyone asks, you found them lying around and had no idea where they came from. Plausible deniability, Stevens said. Exactly. Because the moment this becomes official, the moment I submit this for evaluation through proper channels, it'll disappear into the Ordnance Board for 6 months of testing, and in 6 months, a lot of you kids will have lost your fingers waiting for bureaucrats to approve something that we already know works. So began what would later be called the underground armory of the 8th Air Force. Kepner wasn't alone. Armourers across dozens of airfields in England had seen the same problem, had heard the same stories, had looked at the same frost-bitten hands and decided that official channels moved too slowly when men were losing fingertips every mission. They started making tools. Each armourer had his own design, his own philosophy, but the core concept was always the same. A specialized implement that let gunners clear gun jams while wearing gloves, working in extreme cold, and not losing their fingers in the process. Some tools were simple hooks. Others were complex lever assemblies. One armourer created a spring-loaded ejector that could pop a jammed round free with a single push. Another designed a bolt manipulation tool that gave gunners mechanical advantage, letting them force frozen actions open without the impossible strength requirements of doing it by hand. None of these tools were authorized. None appeared in technical manuals. None had been tested by the Ordnance Board. And all of them were being carried into combat by gunners who'd been shown the tools quietly, in armories after missions, by mechanics who cared more about bringing people home alive than about following regulations. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The official doctrine remained unchanged. Clear jams by hand. Take off your gloves. Accept the frostbite as part of the job. That was the procedure. That was what gunnery school taught. That was what the technical manuals specified. But in practice, by late 1943, probably half the gunners in the 8th Air Force were carrying unauthorized unjamming tools. They didn't talk about it, didn't write home about it, didn't mention it in debriefings. Just carried the tools in flight suit pockets and used them when the guns jammed and thanked God and the armourers that they didn't have to choose between their fingers and their lives anymore. The problem, from a command perspective, was that nobody in authority knew this was happening. Armourers made tools. Gunners used them. Everyone kept quiet because officially using unauthorized equipment on combat aircraft was grounds for disciplinary action. The regulations were clear. Modifications to aircraft or weapon systems required approval through proper channels. And proper channels meant submitting designs to the Ordnance Board, waiting for evaluation, conducting tests, filing reports, and eventually, maybe, possibly getting approval 18 months later. 18 months was longer than most bomber crews' combat tours. 25 missions, if you survived. Most crews didn't make it past 15. The statistical life expectancy of an 8th Air Force gunner in late 1943 was 11 missions. 11 times flying into Germany. 11 times facing Luftwaffe fighters and flak. 11 missions before the numbers caught up with you and you ended up dead, wounded, or missing in action. Nobody was waiting 18 months for the Ordnance Board to approve a tool that already worked. So the underground continued. Armourers made tools. Gunners carried them. Everyone involved understood that this was technically illegal and absolutely necessary, and nobody talked about it above the rank of sergeant. Until December 8, 1943. The date the United States Army Air Force attacked the German submarine pens at Bremen. 260 B-17 seconds. Deeper into Germany than Schweinfurt, longer time over target, worse weather. The mission was a disaster from the start. Cloud cover broke up the formations. German fighters concentrated on the scattered bombers. Flak was so thick you could walk on it, the pilots said afterward. 27 B-17 seconds didn't come home. 270 men killed or missing. But more than that, the gunners were reporting gun jams at unprecedented rates. The cold that day was exceptional, even for winter. 60 degrees below zero at altitude. Gun oil froze solid. Ammunition belts turned brittle. Mechanisms that had been merely sluggish became completely inoperable. The after-action reports told the story. Gunners across the formation were clearing jams every 5 minutes. Some waist gunners reported clearing their guns 10 times during the mission. 10 times exposed bare hands to 60 below metal, 10 times choosing between their fingers and their guns, except for one curious detail that a young intelligence officer named Captain Robert Heinrich noticed while compiling the mission reports. Casualty rates for frostbite were significantly lower than expected given the temperature conditions. Not zero, but lower. Much lower. Only 12 gunners reported to the medical section with serious frostbite, versus the 40 or 50 Heinrich would have expected based on the frequency of reported gun jams. Something didn't add up. Either gunners were clearing fewer jams than they reported, which made no sense, or they were clearing jams without removing their gloves, which, according to official doctrine, was impossible. Heinrich was 24 years old, fresh from intelligence school, and possessed of that dangerous combination of curiosity and access to authority. He started asking questions, started talking to gunners in the mess halls and barracks, started hearing stories about tools that officially didn't exist. The breakthrough came from a tail gunner named Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, who'd flown the Bremen mission and cleared 8 gun jams without taking off his gloves once. Heinrich asked him how. Rodriguez hesitated. then pulled a tool from his flight bag. A hook-ended steel implement with a wooden handle, exactly like the one Charlie Kepner had given to Lawrence Stevens 4 months earlier. "Where'd you get that?" Heinrich asked. "Found it in the armory," Rodriguez said, which was the standard lie every gunner told. "Don't know who made it, don't know if I'm supposed to have it, but it keeps my fingers from freezing off, so I carry it." Heinrich examined the tool. The craftsmanship was obvious. This wasn't salvaged equipment or a field expedient modification. This was purpose-built, designed, manufactured by someone who understood both the M2 Browning's mechanism and the specific problems of operating that mechanism at altitude in winter. "Is this common?" Heinrich asked. "Other gunners have these?" Rodriguez shrugged. "Some do, not all. The armorers don't advertise them. You find one, you use it. You don't find one, you do things the old way and hope you keep your fingers." Heinrich spent the next 2 weeks quietly investigating. Talked to gunners, talked to armorers, talked to flight surgeons who'd been treating frostbite casualties for a year and had noticed the same pattern Heinrich had. Casualties were declining despite increasingly cold weather and longer missions. Something had changed. Some variable in the equation was different. What had changed was that armorers were making tools faster than gunners were losing their fingers. The underground armory had reached critical mass. Enough gunners were using the tools that frostbite rates were dropping. Not to zero, but enough to show up in the statistics if you knew what to look for. Heinrich compiled his findings into a report. Not an accusation, not a list of unauthorized modifications, just an observation. Gunners with access to specialized unjamming tools were experiencing significantly lower frostbite rates than gunners without such tools. The tools appeared to be locally manufactured by aircraft armorers. The tools appeared to be effective. The tools appeared to be completely unofficial. He submitted the report to his commanding officer with a simple recommendation. Instead of disciplining the armorers who were making these tools, maybe the Army Air Force should standardize the design and issue them officially. The report landed on the desk of Colonel William Reed, the commanding officer of Ordnance Operations for the 8th Air Force. Reed was 52 years old, a career officer who'd come up through artillery before transitioning to air operations. He understood bureaucracy, understood regulations, understood that unauthorized modifications to combat equipment were serious violations of standing orders. He also understood that his gunners were coming back from missions with frostbitten hands, and that unauthorized tools were solving that problem better than official procedures were. Reed faced a choice. He could crack down on the armorers, confiscate the tools, and reassert regulatory authority. That would send a clear message about chain of command and proper procedures. It would also result in more gunners losing their fingers, and Reed had signed enough letters to families of dead airmen that he wasn't eager to start. Writing letters explaining why their sons had lost their hands to frostbite because regulations were more important than common sense. Or he could do something that went against every instinct of his career officer training. He could acknowledge that sometimes the mechanics on the ground knew better than the planners in headquarters. On January 15, 1944, Colonel Reed issued what would later be called the Kepner Directive, though Charlie Kepner's name appeared nowhere in the official documents. The directive did 3 things. First, it formally acknowledged that unauthorized unjamming tools were being manufactured and used by aircraft armorers throughout the 8th Air Force. Second, it stated that effective immediately, such tools were no longer considered unauthorized, provided they met basic safety standards and didn't compromise aircraft or weapon integrity. Third, it requested that armorers submit their tool designs to a review board for evaluation and potential standardization. The response was immediate. Within 2 weeks, Reed's office had received 47 different tool designs from armorers across England. Some were simple, some were complex. All of them solved the same fundamental problem. How do you clear a jammed gun at 60 below zero without removing your gloves? The Ordnance Board reviewed the submissions and selected 5 basic designs for official production. A hook tool for feed jams, a lever tool for bolt manipulation, a spring-loaded ejector for stovepipe clearances, a combination tool that handled multiple failure modes, and a specialized implement for clearing frozen ammunition belts without damaging the links. By March 1944, these tools were being manufactured at a factory in Scotland and issued as standard equipment to every bomber gunner in the 8th Air Force. Part number ANJ45 through ANJ49. Official, tested, approved. Exactly the same tools that armourers like Charlie Kepner had been making in machine shops for the past 6 months. Except now, they had formal designations and supply chain authorization. The impact was dramatic. Frostbite casualties among gunners dropped by 73% between January and April 1944. Gun operational rates improved because jams could be cleared quickly without the desperate, fumbling efforts of working bare-handed in extreme cold. Gunners reported feeling more confident in their weapons because they knew a jam wasn't a death sentence anymore. It was just a 15-second procedure with a tool that actually worked. But more than the statistics, more than the operational improvements, what mattered was that gunners stopped losing their fingers, stopped coming back from missions with dead tissue and permanent damage, stopped having to choose between their hands and their survival. Lawrence Stevens completed his combat tour in May 1944. 25 missions. He flew over Germany, over France, over the Netherlands and Belgium. He saw friends die, saw aircraft explode, saw things that would wake him up 30 years later in a cold sweat. But he came home with all 10 fingers intact, and in his flight bag, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, was the original tool Charlie Kepner had given him back in August 1943. The unauthorized, unapproved, technically illegal piece of steel and wood that had saved his hands on more missions than Stevens could count. After the war, Stevens tried to find Kepner, wrote letters to the Army Air Force, got transferred to the United States Air Force when the services separated in 1947, finally tracked him down in 1952. Kepner was working as a civilian mechanic at an aircraft factory in California, still designing tools, still solving problems that official channels moved too slowly to address. Stevens visited him, showed him the original tool, still functional, still carrying the oil stains and metal scratches of 2 years in combat. Thanked him for something that the Army had never officially recognized, for seeing a problem and fixing it without waiting for permission, for understanding that sometimes regulations exist to protect people, but sometimes they kill people, and knowing the difference requires the kind of practical wisdom that doesn't come from technical manuals. Kepner shrugged it off. "Just made some tools," he said. "Nothing special." But it was special, because those tools represented something fundamental about warfare that official histories often miss. That battles aren't just won by generals moving divisions on maps or pilots flying aircraft or planners developing strategies. They're won by mechanics in machine shops at 2 in the morning, looking at reports of gunners with frostbitten hands and deciding that they can do better. That the regulations can wait. That bringing people home alive is more important than following procedures. The M2 gun unjamming tool is now in storage at the National Museum of the United States Air Force. A simple implement. Steel hook, wooden handle, used by a B-17 tail gunner in Europe during World War II. The tool was handmade and used because the cold and gloves hampered dexterity. The museum label doesn't tell you about Charlie Kepner or Lawrence Stevens or the dozens of armourers who made similar tools without authorization. Doesn't tell you about Captain Heinrich, who noticed that frostbite statistics didn't match the mission reports. Doesn't tell you about Colonel Reed, who chose common sense over regulations. Doesn't tell you about the underground network of mechanics who understood that sometimes the people closest to the problem see solutions that headquarters never considers. It just says the tool was used to clear gun jams, which is technically accurate, and completely insufficient, because what the tool really did was give gunners their hands back, gave them the ability to clear a jam without choosing between their fingers and their survival, gave them 15 extra seconds that often made the difference between a gun that worked and a gun that didn't, between a formation that held together and a bomber that fell behind, between coming home and not coming home. By the end of the war, over 100,000 unjamming tools had been manufactured and issued to Army Air Force gunners. They became standard equipment, appearing in technical manuals right alongside ammunition belts and barrel assemblies. The official story would later credit the Ordnance Board with developing these tools through rigorous testing and evaluation. Which is true. The Ordnance Board did test them, did evaluate them, did approve them for production. But they didn't invent them. The armourers did. The mechanics did. The people who watched gunners come back from missions with ruined hands and decided that they could fix this problem faster than headquarters could. That's the real story. Not the official narrative of systematic weapon improvement through proper channels, but the unofficial reality of mechanics making tools in midnight machine shops because they knew what the regulations didn't. That sometimes survival comes from breaking the rules intelligently rather than following them blindly. The M2 Browning continued to be the standard aircraft machine gun for American bombers through the end of the war. Reliable, powerful, capable of incredible rates of fire, and prone to jamming in extreme cold, which meant gunners needed specialized tools to keep them operating. Tools that officially didn't exist for the first 6 months they were saving lives. Tools that were manufactured by armourers who understood that asking permission takes time, and time costs fingers, and fingers don't grow back. One mechanic's unauthorized solution to a problem that regulations said didn't need solving. One tool that let gunners clear jams without removing their gloves. One decision by an officer to overlook the fact that his armourers were breaking regulations if it meant his gunners kept their hands. That's how you win wars, not just with strategy and firepower, but with mechanics in machine shops who care more about bringing people home than about following procedures, with gunners who are willing to carry tools that officially don't exist because those tools actually work, with officers who understand that sometimes the best solution is the one invented by the people doing the job, not the one approved by committees in distant headquarters. Charlie Kepner died in 1976. Never received a medal for the tools he made, never got official recognition for the solution he invented, just went back to civilian life and kept designing things, kept solving problems, kept understanding that sometimes the difference between life and death is a piece of steel bent to the right angle at the right time. But somewhere in California, there's probably still a drawer in a garage with a few of those original tools, handmade, unauthorized, technically illegal when they were first manufactured, and responsible for saving more hands and more lives than most decorated weapons systems ever managed. The regulations caught up eventually. Always do. By 1945, the unjamming tools were official equipment, properly tested and approved, which meant they were legitimate, which meant using them was following the rules, which meant nobody had to hide them anymore or pretend they'd found them lying around. But for those 6 months in late 1943 and early 1944, when the tools were being made in secret and passed to gunners with a quiet word about where they came from and how to use them, those tools represented something more important than regulations. They represented the understanding that sometimes doing the right thing means ignoring the official channels. That sometimes the best solution comes from the bottom up, not the top down. That sometimes a mechanic with oil under his fingernails knows more about keeping people alive than a general with stars on his collar. One tool, one decision to make it without permission. One underground network of armourers who decided that regulations moved too slowly when people were losing their fingers every mission. And thousands of gunners who came home with hands intact because someone cared enough to break the rules. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.